So, of all of the events that we're going to have at Convergent, I love them all, but there's some that I am most passionate about. And this next session is one that is incredibly important, incredibly exciting, and I think will touch you in a way that nothing else quite here will, except for maybe the one video from Kurt. So I want to introduce two guests. We're going to start with Mr. Andrew McCoy, and he is joined by his business partner from Morningstar. They're coming. Yes. Dilip, Joseph. All right. So these gentlemen on the surface have nothing to do with business, have nothing to do with ethics. Dilip is a doctor. He has worked around the globe. He has worked quite a bit in Afghanistan, which is where Morningstar is based. And these two gentlemen have incredibly different backgrounds. As a doctor, when he was in Afghanistan, some of you may have read about it. He was actually kidnapped by the Taliban and carried up into the mountains for a couple of days, then rescued by Navy SEALs in an event that was chronicled both in a book and in many media accounts as well. And what's interesting in that is his undying and unending passion for bringing peace and hope in Afghanistan. Now, what's interesting is his partner Andrew couldn't have a more different background. So Andrew was an Air Force helicopter pilot. He flew a helicopter called a Huey that I have personal experience with. As when I was in the infantry, I got kicked out of one holding onto a rope, screaming the entire way down in air assault school. And from then, he went on to fly a fascinating helicopter, which is the Russian HIP helicopter. So he actually spent some time working with the Afghanistan Air Force and flew that crazy, big, hulking Russian helicopter. So he retired in 2014 and is now the chief operating officer of an extraordinary organization called Morningstar, which is the same organization that Dilip is the medical director for. So we're going to take a little bit of time to learn about Morningstar now, what they do. It is started as one man's dream. It is an extraordinary dream, and it will actually come all the way back to where we started this day, which is actually about you. So let's go ahead and get going. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming today. I really appreciate it. All right, let's go.
Thank you, Patrick. So I think we'll start with just the story of Morningstar development to give you a little bit of a background. The story, I think of the story as an adventure story because it's got danger, it's got intrigue, it's got politics, and it's got hope. You say hope for Afghanistan? Is there hope for Afghanistan? It's a good question. Well, I think so. Our founder, as Patrick mentioned, has a way of repeating a quote by Napoleon Bonaparte that has also become a large kind of a mantra for our leadership development program, which says, leaders are dealers in hope. And so our organization attempts to bring hope, opportunity, and transformation to the people of Afghanistan through economic and community development solutions. So in 1997, our founder was an entrepreneur, businessman, doing a consultant practice, and was thinking about an early retirement, maybe like some of you out there. But it just so happened that one of his friends invited him to Pakistan on the Afghan border. And what he saw there broke his heart, which led to the next 20 years, which is the story of Morningstar. In 1997, Afghanistan had gone through quite a bit, as many of you probably know, the Russian invasion, the Russian withdrawal, civil war, and now about this time the Taliban was taking over, winning the war. And so as he saw this, he knew, and one of his famous quotes is he looked at that and he said, this can't be the Almighty's plan for these people.
So let me just get something straight here. So he's at this refugee camp on the border, and this refugee camp now has a decade and a half of refugees coming over, really starting in 1982, as you mentioned, with the Russian invasion. So I'm imagining these camps are, what, a couple 100,000 people?
So at that time, there was approximately 3 million on the Pakistan side, and somewhere between 2 and 3 million on the Iranian side, and of course more around the world.
So we got a 65-year-old white guy who comes walking into a refugee camp with several million people inside of it and decides this is his life's work.
He didn't decide at that point. I think he still had to get approval from his wife. But he went back with the idea that he had to do something. And so he did. He went back the next year to northern Afghanistan. In fact, he flew into Uzbekistan and drove to the border, crossed over into northern Afghanistan, and was able to get a meeting with General Dostum, who at the time was in charge of what became known as the Northern Alliance. And now General Dostum is the vice president of Afghanistan. So Daniel was surprised at the open arm welcome he got from General Dostum, who said, yes, please come, build your orphanages, build your schools, do something to help us. And so Daniel thought, okay, this is good, and so let's do this. So he went back to the US and started to raise some funds. But 2 weeks later, the Taliban came in and took over Mazar-i-Sharif, where they were, and eventually the whole country. So fast forward the next year. That's the end of the story, right? Well, here we are in 1999, the Taliban now pretty much in control of the whole country. So Daniel has to figure out a way to continue what he feels is this passion he has. And so he decides to knock on the front door, and he goes and manages to get a meeting with the Taliban Ministry of Planning. This fine gentleman here, as he described it, he came into his office and this guy says, "What are you doing here?" And so Daniel quotes as saying, "I have been blessed and I want to be able to bless the Afghan people so that they're not fleeing in such large numbers." And so I think kind of guilted into it, this Taliban official signed the papers and said, "Go do whatever you want." And so he did. And the next year, he pressed these two Taliban officials to start a school. They didn't want to at first, but he was persistent, and he said, "I will do it for you. You don't even have to do anything, just give me permission and I'll do it." And so he was able to hire an Afghan woman to run the school. Of course, the Taliban didn't agree to making it allowable for girls to attend, but at least they got the boys' school going. And then we get into 2001.
I was just quickly reminded, looking at this slide right here, that if I were to ask you guys, how old do you think this guy on the left might be? You might say something like maybe late 40s, 50s, or even 60s. This picture is probably taken when he's in his mid-30s. Just a rugged life that they lead. But he was part of the Taliban, and he had a 180 turn, and he said, "This is not working. I want to actually do something different. I'm going to start a girls' school in my district, in my community." And he actually paid the ultimate price for making that decision. About a decade later, in 2010, he was hunted down by his ex-colleagues and shot. He never made it to Kabul. On the way, he has a car accident and dies in that accident.
So what's amazing is we think about the conversation that we had this morning about that arc of ethics and history. And we talked about in 1920, the women's suffrage movement here in the United States, and you're sharing that an individual who had the courage and fortitude to start a school for young girls in Afghanistan paid the ultimate price for that courage with his life. And I think it shows that that arc is not just over history, but it's also over geography, it's over cultures. There's no judgment at all in right or wrong, and I think having put your heart into a country, you know that there is no right or wrong, but these differences are just extraordinary.
Yeah, and sometimes those type of differences we're hoping for takes a lot of hard work to see. I'll kind of allude to that in the coming up slides. So in 2001, we're still not in the country because Taliban is still ruling it. Not a lot of NGOs are given the freedom to work as we would like to. But Daniel, our founder, came across this harsh winter where people were dying left and right, many children dying, not having a chance to give it a try. So he put together a quilt distribution where he just wrote an email and just wanted to see what would come out of it. He wanted to, I think, raise like $10,000. Within a matter of a few hours, $30,000 came in. He took all that money, put it into the hands of people who could actually put this together, make the quilt themselves, and 30,000 blankets were made out of that. This is late 2001. So we move on to 2002, where we actually do more relief work, but the more we got into it.
Sorry, hold on. So we kind of just skipped past 9/11.
Oh, right.
2001, right? So the horrible events in New York City happened in early September. As a reminder, then in early October, the United States invades when the U.S. Rangers go in and take the airstrip in Kabul and then expand out from there. So kind of talk about where is Daniel and Morningstar around this huge geopolitical event?
So that late 2001 enabled him and a few of his friends to actually go into the country and register.
Oh, sorry. So the Rangers go in and Daniel's right behind them.
Something like that.
With his quilts.
So, well, quilts actually happened in 2001. I mean, yeah, actually, late 2001, that's right. And he was just gearing up. In the humanitarian world, we always laugh at the fact that there are people who are just waiting for the opportunity to do some good. And there are many of my acquaintances, I would just say, waiting for the chance to get into North Korea. When you hear that, you just go, what? You must be crazy. But Daniel was one of those guys.
Right. So, Andrew, you served in the military. I served in the military during Desert Storm as well. And we've both had a lot of trainings, you in the Air Force, myself in the Army. And I think quilt delivery was not one of the things that I recall from basic training, but clearly there's a real benefit to quilt delivery behind Rangers.
It definitely saved a lot of children from dying that winter.
Right.
So we fast forward to 2002 and onwards. Now we're talking, as Patrick said, post-Taliban time. You have much more freedom in the humanitarian world. We talk about how great early 2002 to 2006 was. So much of the infrastructure, thanks to our military and many other humanitarian, maybe thousands of humanitarian agencies that came in to the country and did some great good. They're still kind of reaping the benefits of that foundation that was laid in that early part of 2000s. So we started.
And I think we see Daniel here in the in our far right, correct?
Far right, that's right. That's the man. I made the mistake of talking to him in 2009, not knowing I was signing up for a decade of this type of activity. I just signed up for 2 years, to tell you the truth. And here I am 8.5 years later. He's a great guy. So this is a type
hold on, Andrew, are you in Afghanistan at this point? When did your years of service?
I spent a year from 2011 to 2012, but had also been in and out for shorter terms before that.
Okay. And when was the first time you went?
I went in early 2009.
Okay, so we'll keep going to that.
So, this is sort of how it all starts when we start working in a community. We start talking to the tribal elders, and they pretty much tell the same story. If not, many others within the community want to hear what we want to present to them. And they're essentially looking for a paradigm shift, a shift in values, if you will. But it takes a long time to get there, and some of our work is beginning to, if not have already shown, that great result. So here are a bunch of girls sitting down, what we would consider very normal. These girls never got the opportunity to sit down and actually learn how to read and write during the Taliban time. Here they are being taught by another, better-to-do young girl who actually knew how to read and write, now teaching these young girls. And we take opportunities like that and essentially look for ways to unite or bring a common unity in a country like Afghanistan that is just divided by tribal factions.
So where is this now? Are you out in the countryside? Are you outside of Kandahar and Kabul in these pictures?
This specific one, the one before, we're out of Kabul province. But the one where they're playing basketball right here happens to be within Kabul province, where we put together a community center that has a medical clinic, an education facility, a communication building where they have a radio show and internet cafe. So we're essentially opening up the world to a rural community that would otherwise not have those opportunities. So I remember walking in, I think in late 2009. This is back in the time when I didn't have a Facebook account, but I happened to notice a young man, maybe 8 or 9 years old, checking out his Facebook account, and I just looked over his shoulders and I saw 5,000 friends. And not having an account, I still thought that's pretty impressive. So I asked him, so how do you get 5,000 Facebook friends? And he gave me an answer that was so profound. I still remember it. He said, whenever I come across anybody my age, anywhere around the world, I simply ask the question, how is it to be an 8-year-old where you're growing up?
So in 2004, we had an opportunity to partner with Herat University to start what we call Institutes of Leadership Development. And this is really an outcome of the community center model that we started, and we saw such fruit from the seeds of hope planted in the young people that we thought, well, what if we could get those same kind of principles, that they could look for a future, they could look for a vision for what they could do to improve their country. If we got that into the lives of college graduates and allowed that to take root and spread throughout the country in their leadership positions. So we were able to bring in character-based leadership training, and then also the core part of that is volunteers, essentially, from the business world in the US and Canada and the UK, South Africa, to come for a week or two and teach an area of expertise that they have in business and leadership, principles like trust, about habits of a leader, about ethics, about integrity, anti-corruption, which we really just build on what is integrity. And so these institutes started to grow. We had one then in Kabul, starting in Herat, Kabul, Faizabad up in the north, now Mazar-e Sharif, and and the Afghan government has asked us, said that they want an Institute for Leadership Development in every city that has a university. And so we're hoping for the future for that to happen. But over 1,200 young Afghans have graduated from these programs, including, in fact, the youngest Afghan female parliamentarian who has risen within the government. Also, one who's just at the highest levels in the presidential palace, even one that's in the Supreme Court, which Patrick has had a chance to converse with, because we're hoping that technology could accelerate the momentum that we're seeing in this transformation towards ethics.
Yeah, and that's one of the amazing opportunities that we have at Convergent, is we are literally in talks right now to utilize conflict of interest and the helpline inside the Afghani Supreme Court. And so, you know, if you think about that idea of driving ethics to the center, we certainly think about that in the business side. But when we also talk about for the better world, you know, the idea that this group of 130 people can literally implement technology inside the Afghani Supreme Court. And, you know, it's an ongoing process. It's not necessarily going as quick as we would like, but certainly the partnership is one that is extraordinarily enthusiastic for me.
Yes, things are slow in this world, sure. So we're hoping that those principles and those programs will keep the door open for this seed of hope, that we can continue to be able to allow these Afghans to learn, but also to see the models of leaders coming in to help them in their work. So of all the different things we've done within Afghanistan, we've kind of come up with 4 different pillars, we say, of how we work. One is the leadership development programs. We also have medical training and services, the community centers, as you saw, and then now refugee assistance, because it really started with refugees back in 1997, And we're seeing, of course, that with the crisis right now with refugees around the world, that the opportunity is out there that when they come to a new place, they're looking and their minds are open to hear a different way of living, and we can actually help them navigate that.
So do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I can give you a story
Yeah.
about this. I remember getting done with medical school and wondering whether I want to sign up for the same conventional ways of doing medicine.
Yep.
As many of my colleagues, as while there's nothing wrong with that, I just didn't find that very attractive. So in a place like Afghanistan, during the Taliban time, while I was going through medical school, we couldn't find any data. You know, we're talking about ethics here, and it's driven by data, right? I know you guys believe in the fact that knowledge is the beginning of change. Within our leadership and medical and other arena, we want to keep pushing for that knowledge, and even perhaps, if you will, one step further to wisdom, and see whether we can allow, through transformative values, allow for those key changes that we're looking for. And some of them take time, but you begin to see that just by being present, you usher in the change that would never be present. So here's an old man, maybe in his 60s or so. He's now, compared to what was available in the Taliban time, less than 5% accessibility to any sort of healthcare. Now, we were talking very, very basic stuff, you know, like a mobile clinic. But now, even as early as 2012, we were assessing above 85% of the Afghan population having access to healthcare. That's a huge change within a matter of just a decade. Again, thanks to great work the NATO forces have done in improving the infrastructure. So here's a man who has to probably come on his donkey, traveling a good 2 to 3 hours to get to this clinic, but this is the only clinic that's available for 57 different villages. Yes, that's right, 57 different villages in the outskirts of Kabul province. So one of the reasons why I do what I do is because this makes a difference in his life, certainly for the entire community as well.
So let's talk about that for a moment. So you graduated from med school when?
In 2008.
2008, you graduate med school. So you make the decision at that point that you are going to take care of the neediest around the world.
Right.
You come to a clinic like this, and this isn't the school where you had all the equipment and all of this stuff. Talk about a day in the life inside this clinic. What are the experiences you had? How did you communicate with your patients? And communicate not just in the verbal form, but how did you communicate with them culturally? When women came in, et cetera. I mean, these are just tremendous differences.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are many barriers when a foreigner goes in spite of the fact that I'm ethnically Indian and I can fly under the radar, so to speak. I still have language barriers, right? So with my background in public health and preventive care, most of what I do is actually train the local guys so they can go about doing what they need to do more effectively. So I haven't actually done any clinical medicine, unless of course I have to. Sorry about the gory picture here. It's not as bad as when blood was all over the floor. But you know, once in a while you get very interesting cases where they just present themselves right in front of you. But most of my work is really to equip the locals. It's never the lack of local resources. It's a lack of management of those resources. Patrick, you alluded to the fact that I spent some time with the Taliban. You know, I'm always reminded of the fact that the guy that I have worked with for 5 years straight in the country, going in and out, and who translates for me, did all the training with me, he was, in 2013, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, when you think about the Peace Prize, Afghans are not the first people that you think of. But then again, when you look at the history of the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, many Muslims have actually won that. So you go figure. But But working with the local folks, knowing that they are capable of making the transformative changes that you want to see in the country is number one key, I think. You're not demeaning the people that you work with. You see the value in the people that you work with. So that makes a huge difference.
Got it. So 2 questions here, one for you and then Andrew, one for you. So I want to come back to this idea of healthcare for females. Okay, so obviously at a cultural level, the divide between males and females is tremendous. And so is there a difference because of the healthcare that a female can get 5 years ago or even today in Afghanistan versus what a male can get because of those gender gaps, of the inability for male practitioners to have really direct involvement with female practitioners? What is the difference in that?
Great question. I'll take a crack at it first. So during Taliban time, women were not, they didn't even make it to the scale.
Right. So it's not like there weren't female medical graduates, right? That's what I was getting at is from the practitioner standpoint, you didn't have a cadre of female nurse practitioners, doctors, medical professionals.
Well, before that, we tend to forget the fact that during, or maybe right before the Russian times, maybe 50s and 60s, Afghanistan was actually known as the Switzerland of Central Asia. There's a huge difference from how we know Afghanistan now. So although during the Mujahideen, the tribal warfare that went on between tribes, and then Taliban, there weren't a lot of females who were equipped or encouraged to go to school. There were still people going to Pakistan or India or Iran to get trained. And as soon as the regime collapsed, Taliban regime collapsed, they came back within a matter of a few years. Although during Taliban time, even as patients, this is what the females had to do. Imagine as a mother going through this. If a mother is not allowed to see, imagine what the children go through, right? So females as patients would have to go and see a male doctor who sits 2 screens beside her. He would have to have an interpreter who he speaks through, who has very little medical background. And so the female patient talks through the interpreter and then to the doctor and gets translated back and forth.
Yeah, nothing could go wrong there.
No, absolutely nothing. So therefore you saw the morbidity and mortality rates. That's probably what we could gather, probably the worst the world has ever seen. So from that, fast forward 2 or 3 years later, there were practitioners available, or the way we work, mainly in the rural communities, you get people who can't even read and write, but teach them the basic health education material that they need to know. Then they go and transfer that information to people all around the different villages where they live. So we call them community health workers.
Okay. So Andrew, I'm going to switch topics here. So in many parts of the world, I would think particularly in Afghanistan, the way that you get things done is money, right? The way that the billions of dollars that have come through international aid, through the US government, that have literally just disappeared into the economy is in the billions of dollars. So here you are, you're trying to build schools, you're trying to open health clinics. It is impossible that you were not asked to be a part of the system of making those payments, of being involved in that process. So how does Morningstar, when faced with that ethical decision of, I need to get this school done, I got to get the concrete in, and this government official needs to pay a tax? How did you handle that?
We still handle it every day, I think, and because a tax, right, is a tax.
One person's taxes, yes.
Is another man's bribe, right? So yeah, it's a situational thing, and we push back. I know even in our programs that we have, every year the taxes go up, but every year the taxes go up in America too, right? So so each situation is different, and so when it comes to actually paying a fee, and it's to a local person, in that case, sometimes we consider it a fee for service or a tax. But what we're doing in Afghanistan is like Dilip said, we are helping the locals do the work. So we really are employing people and equipping them with the skills and the leadership capabilities to make a difference themselves. So it's not the white Westerner coming in and paying down a lot of money, because the money that we have goes to our local staff. And so we alleviate a lot of that because we're working through locals.
Got it.
But you're right, there's some cases where a tax is a bribe and you can't get around that.
Got it. So that's an interesting ethical dilemma when you're creating schools with the hope of having those students go into government to try to root corruption out from the inside. And it's easy to talk about in the comfort of this air-conditioned hotel here in Denver, but what I'm hearing is when you're on the ground, that line isn't black and white at all. It's just an endless form of gray.
Yeah, it's true. I think I wanted to get off the gory slide, but this slide, which kind of is my story, it actually touches on that, because the picture on your left there is what I call, during my military deployment there, was a picture of fear and frustration. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were dealing with one of the most corrupt cultures in the world. And so I was frustrated that we couldn't get anything done because we were going to do things the American way. We were coming in with policies and procedures, and we asked them to do it this way, or else they weren't going to get more helicopters, which they did anyway. So, and the picture on the right is one in which I was able to go back in May this year as a civilian, and instead of fear and frustration, it's a picture of trust and hope. And so, getting back to the corruption and the bribery issue, in the military, we were really trying to force the fact that, no, you can't. For example, we always had a problem with siphoning gas out of the helicopter by the mechanics, because they would go and sell it and feed their family. So we would always say, you can't do that. And we would go to the commander and say, you have to fire this guy, he's stealing fuel from the helicopters. And he would just look at us and say, you're coming from America, you probably made, they thought we made hundreds of millions, thousands a year, and you're trying to tell us that he can't take 5 gallons of gas home in order to feed his family or heat his home. And so there was just that lack of trust. I didn't trust them, they didn't trust me. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that I was wearing body armor, carrying 2 weapons, and they weren't. It's kind of hard to have that relationship of advising and mentoring when you've got all the weapons and they have nothing. So you don't have the trust. But on the right there, we really are trying to model integrity, trying to model trust by saying, no, we're not with the military, we're not protected any more than you are right now. And so they can then open that conversation about bribery. In fact, this particular class right here, I love the story of just this one, if I can, just one person who I still maintain a WhatsApp relationship with. And because we were able to have that conversation, he was able to say, I'm part of the problem. I am corrupt, as we were talking about corruption. And so he says, well, what do I do? If I don't pay the bribe, I don't keep my job. And I've got 2 girls at home and a wife, and so what do I do? And so so it's a difficult question, right? So we talked about the cycle of integrity and the cycle of impunity, and how when one leader stands up, others can see that and they have hope that maybe they too could stand up. And then maybe that will produce a movement of integrity and away from the corruption. And I think that is happening. And so he said, I will do this. And I got a Facebook message from him just a couple weeks ago and said, I stood up and I did not pay the bribe, and I lost my job. That's difficult. So continue to walk with him through that and helping connect him with another ILD graduate who gets it and has started a software company there in Herat to either get a job or find connections where there's this kind of community of people who get it when it comes to ethics.
If I could just give a quick story, Andrew, what you're talking about from the ILD reminded me of a story that happened in Herat, same place where one of our doctors running a clinic had to deal with the governor's daughter walking into the clinic and expected quick service, expedient service. And he simply looked at her and said, you have to wait in line just like the rest of them. And he lost his job the very next day. What happened as a result was a bunch of his friends decided to strike in the same clinic and the adjoining hospital. And as a result of that, the entire governor and his office took note and said, what we did is not right. So somewhere along the way, for the cycle to end, somebody has to stand up and take, it might be hard, it'll be very hard. They pay a very big price than us, where we have forgotten what it has taken for us to really experience the freedom that we experience now.
So give us a little story about this picture here.
I think it's Daniel and Rafiq. Here's a medical advisor that I've had the privilege of working with. I think now it's out of my hand. Let me just quickly finish the story I was telling you about him. Remember I told you that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. If you remember, in 2013, another prominent person who was nominated was Malala Yousafzai, a 16-year-old Pakistani girl that got shot by the Taliban. Now, he lost out, right? So any opportunity I get, I make it a point to remind him that he lost to a 16-year-old girl, which is pretty bad in his culture, but doesn't mean much to us. But so it sounds like when Andrew and I were talking, it's like really serious stuff. We have the privilege of doing heart-to-heart, meaningful interactions with folks who are desperately searching for it and ask us the deeper questions. Why? Why do you do what you do? And how can we incorporate these values and these changes to our society we're dealing with?
So we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'll ask each of you the same question. Dilip, you have been back to Afghanistan time and time again. You almost paid with your life. You have a medical license. You could go do most anything you want. Why do you get out of bed and with children at home, a family that you're growing, and go do this again every single day when the risk is extraordinary, as you very personally know, and the reward is measured in thousandths of an inch? Like, why do you do it?
I'm glad you brought up my family and my children. I'm reminded through being a father that what we do is very similar to parenting. I've learned the hard way now being a father over the past close to 13 years, and my wife and I, we have 5 kids, that parenting is very hard, and values that the kids really learn are much better caught than taught. And it's very similar in community development. You can't beat these values over the head and say, just learn this, but you have to actually demonstrate it. So as a ILD professor, Andrew and I and Daniel and many others who go in and out, and people who live there and run these programs, demonstrate these values through their lives. And people are watching very, very carefully. And so for me, one of the main reasons why I do this is because I picked up, even while I was a public health student, that we can't bring in these changes that we desperately seek overnight. In public health and medicine, we tend to mainly wash over the deeper questions because we don't have the time to deal with it. You come in with internal bleeding or whatever. As soon as I decipher that, I try to fix it just to sort of fix that particular problem. So it's more of a superficial fix. Now, you might have many reasons why you presented with that symptom. So giving the time and demonstrating through our lives, it's our hope that over time that shift happens and people begin to believe in better things, better paradigms, better worldviews that would really usher in the transformation.
Excellent. So Andrew, a career in the military, time at another nonprofit. Here you are, you're the new guy on the block. What drives you to do this?
I think it goes back to that picture of fear in a way that I'd say it this way. Maybe significance over security. I did a career in the military and I honor veterans. I appreciate, if you're a veteran in here, thank you. But I found that in the military, the highest value really, at some point, somehow I caught it as security. Keep myself safe, keep my guys safe, keep my country safe, keep my family safe, and then we'll be okay. That's success. But I read somewhere recently we have 80,000 hours, I think it is, in our life to work. And so maybe I have 35,000 left, and I want it to be something of significance. And so being able to even move something a millimeter in the right direction in a place like Afghanistan, just because I can, and I have the opportunity, and I've met Daniel, the fateful conversation, that's really what I want to spend the rest of my life doing.
All right. Well, I think it's an absolutely incredible story. I appreciate your coming down and sharing that with us today. You know, we talk about the world of ethics that we live in, and this brings it into such stark reality when ethics means that person doesn't have a job, right? When ethics means that that teacher's life was taken. It puts it into an entirely different perspective. And I think when you see a face like this, it is the perfect way to end. So we'll finish up with, why don't you tell us this gentleman's story? Who is this?
This is a guy from Faisalabad, which is the northeastern part of Afghanistan. And what's really impressive about this guy is that our current country director, a family that comes out of Dallas area, actually met up with him back in early 2000s and just started conversing with him. In a matter of a few months, you'll never catch an Afghan smiling. I think they're just trained not to smile, especially for camera. His life just changed. He used to look through the filter of complete negative, there's no hope whatsoever, to saying, I have a chance to live today. Let me make that difference. So that's the story behind that smile.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. It was an extraordinary conversation.